We had a great question come in from one of our listeners about how to increase her Listen Notes ranking. So I thought in this episode, I would break down what these rankings even are, whether they really matter when it comes to your podcast, and 3 practical steps that you can take starting today if you want to work on increasing your ranking on Listen Notes, as well as the overall popularity of your podcast. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy.
Hi, Courtney. As a host of the podcast Omni Mindfulness, which is currently ranked in the top 10% globally by Listen Score, with over 140 releases, I'm diligently working on improving my podcast score through the Pod Match course, which I am just now completing. I have a clear vision, clear understanding of my niche avatar, and strong discipline. My goal is to reach top 1% ranking and secure appropriate sponsorship aligned with my niche. Could you please provide guidance on strategies to elevate my listen score from top 10% to top 1% and advice on attracting the potential sponsors that would be a good fit for my audience? Thank you so much for all your content, and I appreciate you and your time. This is Shilpa, the host of the Omni Mindfulness podcast.
Shilpa, this is a great question. This is a big question. We've got a lot to unpack here. But first of all, for you listening, if you're not familiar with Podmatch or PodScore, these are 2 tools that were created by my good friend Alex Sanfilippo to help you find better guests for your podcasts, or podcasts that you can guest on, and a self-assessment tool to see what areas your podcast is doing really well and what areas you might have room to improve. And I've put links to both of those tools in the show notes for you. So Shilpa, awesome work on releasing over 140 episodes on your podcast and for already earning yourself a top 10% ranking on Listen Notes, because that tells me that you're someone who is really committed to your podcast as a host, which is something I love to see. And having that goal of reaching the top 1% on Listen Notes is a great goal to strive for. And my goal in this episode is to give you some first steps that you can take toward that. But before we get there, I want to quickly break down Listen Notes for those who might not be familiar or who might not be completely familiar with how Listen Notes works. So what Listen Notes is it is a podcast search engine that helps make podcasts accessible to people all around the world. So if you have a podcast, your show is available on Listen Notes right now, whether you know it or not, whether you've claimed it or not. And in fact, if you've never gone in to claim your show, I definitely recommend doing that. Listen Notes will give you a blue check mark similar to that verified check mark on Instagram. So just go to listennotes.com, type in your podcast name. When it comes up, click the podcaster tab, and then there'll be a big red button there that says claim your podcast. So just click that and follow the steps. But something that's unique to Listen Notes is podcast scores. And since there's nowhere that we can currently go to see how many downloads a show actually has, or to determine the true size or popularity of a show, this can be a very helpful feature for gauging the relative popularity of your podcast. And there's a reason I say relative popularity. This is really important, and we'll get to that in a second. But what we like using Listen Notes for personally is part of our vetting process. Like whenever I go on a podcast tour and as a guest on other people's podcasts, I like to go and check out that podcast on Listen Notes to see not only how many episodes they have and how long they've been podcasting, but what their listen scores are. Because Listen Notes will automatically assign 2 scores to your show, and they aggregate this from first and third party data. They update it about once a month. And score number 1 is called a listen score. This is a metric that shows the estimated popularity of your podcast. Okay, so basically what they're doing is they're comparing your podcast to other RSS-based public podcasts in the world. And the higher your listen score, the more popular your show is, according to Listen Notes. So it's kind of like a basketball score. The higher, the better. On the flip side of that, they also give you a global ranking. And this metric shows where your show ranks in popularity of all shows globally. So unlike the Apple charts, which is just showing the rankings on the charts of shows Inside of Apple's algorithm, Listen Notes is aggregating data from all podcasts and showing you a global ranking score to show where your show ranks in relation to other shows. So for this score, the lower the number, the better, kind of like a golf score. So for example, at the time of this recording, this podcast that you're listening to right now on Listen Notes is one of the top 1% most popular shows out of over 3.3 million podcasts globally. That said, I want you to keep one thing in mind when it comes to Listen Notes, because Listen Notes, and many people don't realize this, but they're looking at all podcasts in mapping these scores. They're not just looking at active podcasts. And that's a big difference because over 2.9 million people have stopped podcasting. So what I want you to know as a podcast host is while Listen Notes can be a helpful tool for getting a general sense of the relative popularity of a podcast, of the longevity of a podcast, of the seriousness and committedness of the host, since longer standing podcasts generally will have higher scores, it's not entirely accurate because it's also accounting for all podcasts, even the inactive ones or those that have ever published a single episode. But as long as you have a clear understanding of how this works, you can by all means use Listen Notes as a tool to give you a general sense of how your podcast stacks against other podcasts. Maybe one day they will figure out how to stop aggregating data, quote unquote data from inactive podcasts, and then these numbers will be a lot more accurate, which is why there are different metrics that podcast educators like me tend to look at to determine the true success of a show. But Listen Notes, because it is a public platform, because it is widely aggregated, can be a good starting benchmark since it's one of the most widely referred to platforms in this sense. As long as we are on the same page there, we can continue. So Shilpa, it sounds like you've got a top 10% ranking on Listen Notes right now, and you want to get that to the top 1%. This is a great goal. Many podcast hosts have this goal. We have a lot of clients that come to us and say, I want to be top 1% on Listen Notes. However, one thing I want you to notice right off the bat is that this is an outcome-based goal. So the first step that I'm going to give you is to shift this to an action-based goal. This is something we teach our clients to do because two things. Number one, it helps you stay focused on the work that actually matters. And number two, it's going to help you stay in the game longer as a podcast host. So for example, an outcome-based goal would be trying to reach a target number of cumulative downloads. Like, I want 1,000 downloads an episode. I want 100,000 downloads on my podcast. I want 1 million downloads on my podcast. Or it could also be trying to reach a certain ranking or a certain score. In this case, on Listen Notes, I want top 1%. An action-based goal would be X number of episodes published over a specific time frame. I'm going to publish 1 episode a week for the next year. Or maybe it's your first 100 episodes, or in your case, Shilpa, 200 episodes or 250 episodes. And we found in our experience, focusing on these action-based goals takes you a lot further faster because it keeps you on the right activity needed in order to reach the outcome that you want. So when people ask me, how do I increase my ranking? One thing that I'll say is stop focusing on the ranking. Like, yes, we can get you ranked. We can get you in the top 100 on Apple. We can get you to a top 1% on Listen Notes, but we get there by doing these activities. So instead of focusing on outcome, we need to focus on action. So the first step to increase your rankings, whether it's top 100 on Apple, top 1% on Listen Notes, is simply shifting from an outcome-based goal to an action-based goal for every aspect of your podcast. So hold that thought because we are going to circle back to this. But we also need to make one more shift before we can get into the practical steps of what you can do to start increasing your rankings and growing your following and growing your listener base. And that second shift we need to make is something I call build the bridge. So instead of looking at going from top 10% to top 1%, which is a big leap, let's close that gap because this is going to make it easier for you to realize progress. So instead of focusing on going from 10% to 1%, let's see what we can do to get that from 10 to 5%, which is the next tier on Listen Notes. And then when you get to 5%, now shift it from, okay, how can I go from 5% to 3%, which is the next Listen Notes tier? Then from 3% to 2%, then 2% to 1%, and so forth. Kind of like building a bridge across a river with stepping stones. You can't just drop the stones on the river all at once. To get across the river, you got to lay one stone at a time. So based on where you're currently ranking on Listen Notes, the first stone, if you will, would be from 10% to 5%. And the good news is there's many ways to do this. In fact, every single strategy that we teach inside of Pod Launch will ultimately impact your Listen Notes score, because these scores are driven by the same metrics that Apple looks at for ranking your show. And these metrics, you might have heard me talk about them before. They are how many people are following your show, that follow button at the top with the little plus sign. How many people have clicked that? How many people are actively listening to your show every week? How many unique listeners do you have to your show? How many downloads are you getting to your show? How many people have rated your show, which is the star rating? And how many people have left a written review? So those are the 5 metrics: follows, listens, downloads, ratings, and reviews. The Pod Launch methodology is uniquely designed to increase all of the above. Clients who relaunch their podcasts, in fact, see significant jumps on Listen Notes. In fact, one of them stands out in my mind. She jumped from 10% to 2% in a week when she relaunched her podcast. In fact, many of our clients who've been podcasting now a year or more tend to sit anywhere from top 3% to top 1% on Listen Notes. And there are many reasons for this, but really it boils down to 3 things: messaging, positioning, and momentum. So this is where it gets fun, because here's where we can really talk strategy. If we know that a Listen Notes score is driven by the same metrics Apple's looking at: follows, listens, downloads, ratings, reviews. And to increase follows, listens, downloads, ratings, and reviews, we need to reach new listeners. And if we know that messaging, positioning, and momentum are the main drivers of a show's ability to reach new listeners, then let's drill down and look at one thing you can do in each of these 3 areas to help drive more traffic to your show, and thus, over time, increase not just your ranking potential on Apple, but your Listen Notes score as well. So the first thing we want to look at is messaging. This is the backbone of your entire podcast. And Shilpa, it sounds like you have a clear understanding of your niche avatar, which is great. Yet, I will also say this: every podcaster that we have ever worked with, no matter how great of an expert that they were in their field and in their niche, who has said exactly this: I have a very clear understanding of who I'm here to help, was still missing a very key element in their messaging that, once it was dialed in, shifted everything for their podcast. The missing piece was problem awareness. Now, we won't go too deep into this here because there are other episodes where I have covered this, and we'll link to those in the show notes. But Shilpa, one thing you want to make sure you're doing, if you haven't already, is to identify the top 3 problems that your podcast solves for people. And then you want to gear all of your podcast content, and especially your episode titles, to demonstrating and showing people how you solve these problems. The problem is, a lot of people haven't dialed this in as deep as they think they have, or as deep as they could dial it in. And they're like, oh, I've done all that work. I've done the niche work. I know who I'm speaking to. She's a woman. She's in her mid-30s. She's a mom. She's a busy entrepreneur, right? Whoever it is. And they start telling me the demographics of that person. But they aren't explaining to me who that person is psychologically. Because one of the things we see a lot of experts doing is speaking to something that they think is the problem, but that their listener or their ideal client is not currently experiencing as their problem. They're speaking to the root problem, not the current experience of how that problem is showing up in their life. Let's say you have chronic migraines, and the root cause is that you have TMJ and you don't know it. But right now, you're just experiencing the migraine. So speaking to the TMJ piece of that on your podcast is not actually going to be helpful for the person who's in pain having a migraine attack. So this is something we need to learn to do to shift our language and our communication as experts, as podcast hosts, to be able to connect with those listeners and show them, I can help you solve the problem you're experiencing, and then reveal those deeper problems in your communication to them. So this is at a very 30,000-foot view. If you want to dive deeper into this, a great episode would be episode 239 with Brandon Lucero. I will link to that in the show notes as well. But knowing what problems you solve for your listener will ultimately help you do 3 things. It's going to set you apart from other podcast hosts and other experts who are teaching something similar to you, because it will suddenly help your listener understand why your podcast is the one they need to listen to, which over time is going to help you attract more people to your podcast. And that is how we grow a podcast. It's not by telling our warm audience a new episode dropped, posting on social media, hey guys, a new episode is out, emailing your list, hey, a new episode is out. No, they already know you have a podcast. They already probably listen to your podcast and they already like you and trust you. In order to grow our podcast, we got to reach cold listeners. The way we reach cold listeners and help them understand our show is the one they need to listen to is through messaging. And it's through communicating your intimate understanding of the problem, not that you know they have, but the problem they're experiencing right now. And ultimately what this will do over time is help you convert more of those cold listeners to loyal listeners over time. So identifying these top 3 problems that your podcast solves is just the first step of what you need to be doing on the messaging front. But this alone, over the long run, will give you a net positive in terms of your listen notes score, because this invisible backbone of your podcast, this messaging, is not something that people necessarily see, but it's what they will experience when they interact with your show. Whether that's clicking through to read your description, scrolling down to look at your episode titles, clicking play on an episode for the first time, listening to that episode, and coming back for more. Because these are the things that we want to be signaling to the podcast players and also Listen Notes, who's aggregating this data, to look at to say someone is engaged with my podcast. And collectively, compounding over time, I am getting more people who are engaged with my podcast. And that compounds over time. So that's piece number 1, puzzle piece number 1. Puzzle piece number 2 is your positioning. Now, when it comes to podcast positioning, the way that I look at this is twofold. On one side of the coin, it's how does your podcast stand out against others of its kind? And on the flip side of that, how does your podcast stand out on the podcast platforms itself? For example, on Apple. Because again, the goal is that we want people following, listening, downloading, rating, and reviewing. Now, there are ways to increase all 5 of these things. And the cumulative effect of increasing all 5 of these metrics is going to ultimately boost your Listen Notes score over time. But what I would say is a first step, don't focus on all 5. Pick one. Pick one to focus on. Let's just say, for example, you're like, okay, I want to focus on listens. I want to focus on getting people more engaged with my episodes, listening till the end, and coming back for more. Great. Now, what we want to do is pick an action-based activity that we can focus on in order to increase the outcome we want, which is more listens. And what I would say is you could either look at focusing on your episode length and dialing that in to increase the overall amount of time someone's listening to your episodes. Or you could look at your episode structure, which over the long run may help you increase conversions as well. And I've got great episodes on this that I will link to in the show notes for you, because this is the kind of stuff we talk about here on the podcast, which no other podcast experts are exploring to the depth that we do here. Because these are the things, the invisible aspects, your messaging, your positioning, that will really help you stand out in an increasingly crowded podcast landscape. Now, let's say you wanted to focus on downloads. Well, then that would be a different activity that you would want to focus on. For example, you could increase your output. Instead of 1 episode a week, test 2. Test a bonus episode. Test increased output, additional episodes. If you don't have the bandwidth for that right now, that's okay. Pick something else to focus on. I'm just giving examples here. But bottom line is you want to pick one of these areas to focus on as a first step, and then pick an action-based goal, an activity that you can focus on for a definite amount of time, a concrete amount of time, and then evaluate. So that's our process here behind the scenes, guys. It's pretty simple. When it comes to growing the podcast, there are a lot of strategies that we teach. There's a lot that you can do, but most of it boils down to simply picking an action-based activity that you can do for a set amount of time, and then knowing what data to review and how to read the data to know if that action-based activity is worth continuing, if it needs tweaking, or if it can be layered in then with an additional strategy to help build that cumulative momentum over time. Which brings me to puzzle piece number 3 of this whole equation, momentum. Often in the podcast space, I mean, how many times have you heard this? Just stay consistent. Just don't quit. If consistency were the key to growing your podcast over time, to increasing your rankings, then everyone who releases an episode every week and who has done so for a year or more would have a top 1% score on Listen Notes. And we both know that's not the case. So instead, what I want you listening to my voice right now, what I want you to do is delete that just stay consistent mantra and replace it with my formula for momentum, which is right activity plus time equals momentum, or what we label here internally at PodLaunch as long-term audience growth. Now, there are two types of traffic that are required to grow a podcast over time. One is knowing how to get more listeners to your show, and the other is knowing how to convert those listeners into clients and customers. Now, if your goal is to increase your follows or your listens or any of those 5 metrics that we've been talking about, what I want you to focus on here is driving traffic to your podcast. And again, there's many ways you can do this, but one of the easiest that I have found is to go on a podcast tour. It does take some time, but you're already a podcast host. You're already an expert in what you speak on. You already have your setup. You've got your mic, you've got your headphones, you've got your laptop. All of that's ready to go. Now we just need to get your message in front of new audiences. Now, I will say this, while a podcast tour is the low-hanging fruit in terms of increasing your follows and listens and getting your message in front of new podcast listeners, I have had 2 very different experiences going on podcast tours. And this goes back to puzzle piece number 1, which is your messaging has to be dialed in order for this strategy to work. Because I have done podcast tours where I have burnt myself out going on podcast after podcast after podcast, thinking it was going to help me grow my show. But I didn't see an uptick in listeners at all. I didn't see an increase in conversions at all. And for a long time, looking back on those episodes, I was like, where did I miss the mark? Why isn't this strategy working for me? I didn't have my messaging dialed in. And so people were not converting to new listeners, much less clients and customers. But once I dialed in my messaging and went out podcast touring again, those are the episodes that have turned into our top lead generators for our business. So it all goes back to messaging. And if you're listening right now and you feel like, Courtney, I hear you talk about this all the time and I need help. I don't know what to do with my messaging. I don't know what I don't know. I don't know if my messaging is off, but clearly I'm not getting the conversions. I'm not getting the listens. So maybe something's off. Then head to the show notes, click the link, book a call so that we can help you. Because to be honest, this is the biggest thing that we see most podcasts missing the mark on. And it affects everything. It affects your growth. It affects your listens. It affects your downloads. It affects your podcast's ability to convert. All of it. But with this dialed in, then all you have to do when it comes to this specific strategy to increase listens is identifying other podcasts with adjacent audiences to you. The type of audience that is perfect fit for you. It's your perfect fit listener. It's your perfect fit ideal client, but it's not competing with you. This is really important. At a high level, you want to make sure the audience that you are speaking to on someone else's podcast is the audience that you need to be in front of. And that the topic you're going to be speaking to is going to add to that host podcast by filling a content gap that maybe they haven't explored. And you want to make sure, if your goal is conversions, that your offer does not compete with any offer that that host may have. And the beauty is you can actually use listen notes here to your advantage to determine the relative popularity of a show and if it's worth the time for you to interview, depending on your bandwidth. What we want to do is we want to make sure that you are appearing on the podcasts that are most likely to help you reach the outcomes that you want. And so what I do is we actually, in our vetting process, will use listen notes. And as hard as it is, I have to be so selective now about what shows I appear on. But listen notes helps us gauge the relative popularity of a podcast and also the topics that that host has talked about, whether that show is really a good fit for me as a guest and also for the host to have me on as a guest, because I don't want to go on a podcast that I can't actually add value to. So again, there's a lot that we could unpack here as well. But bottom line is that I want you to throw out the just stay consistent mantra. Let me just give it more time and replace that with right activity plus time equals momentum. And remember those 2 types of traffic. And if the outcome you want is to increase your ranking, then what we want to do is focus on getting your podcast in front of new listeners who are cold to you. So all of that said, I've just given you some very practical steps that you can take to increase your listen score. But I saved the best advice for last. And the best advice that I can give you is forget the score. Forget the freaking score. Shift your focus back to your listeners. What is it that they need to hear from you this week? What episodes have you released recently that you're looking in your dashboard and you're like, holy cow, those downloads were a lot higher than I normally see, where your listeners are telling you exactly what content they want to see more of? What action-based goal can you set for yourself over the next 90 days? Because ultimately, if we want to grow our listener base, the number one thing that we need to do as podcast hosts is to first create a space where listeners want to be in the first place. And at the very core level, from an energetic perspective, you do that by putting your focus on your listener. In fact, in planning this episode today, Shilpa, I created this episode for you because I know that this is an area where you are actively working right now and you are wanting to grow. And all of my notes and everything here was geared towards helping you know the next best steps that you can take toward reaching the goals that you are setting for yourself in your podcast. And by default, that's also going to help others here who want to do the same. But my energy in the past used to be, oh, well, I need to make sure people know that I know what I'm talking about. It was unconscious. I didn't realize that that was what I was putting out, but it was a thought in my head because I felt inadequate. I didn't feel like enough of an expert. I didn't feel like I always knew what I'm talking about. I still don't. To be honest, I don't. I don't know all the things. I don't have all the answers, but who does? None of us do. And so what I want you to remember as the host, you are in a very powerful place as an expert because not only do you have the platform, and not only are you working on the positioning to really set yourself apart from others who are teaching the same stuff as you, but we have an opportunity as podcast hosts to use our voice to create meaningful change, to use our voice to connect with people. And that's going to make your podcast that much more engaging, that much more real, and that much more valuable for the community that you're building. And this is so key. So this subtle shift is one that all of us should be practicing on every single episode that we put out. Right now, when you go to plan your next episode, what I want you to do is think about your listener. What is it that they need most? Not what do you want to talk about most, or what do you think you should be talking about this week, but what do they need from you? What do they need to hear this week? And how can you connect with them? So Shilpa, I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a DM on Instagram. I'm at the Courtney Elmer. And for you listening, feel free to do the same. If you have questions after listening to this episode, shoot me a DM, shoot me a voice note, and I'll answer you back. And then stick around because in the next episode, I'm going to continue unpacking this and walk you through the steps that I take when I hit a content block as a podcaster and when I have episodes to create. And in the next episode, I'm going to show you exactly what I do when you hit a block, right? Like a writer's block, and you're like, I just don't know what to talk about this week. And I'm going to teach you exactly what I do to help you reconnect with your listener, come up with content that actually speaks to them, that actually moves them to action, and keeps your content from feeling repetitive or boring. So if you're ready to learn how to do that, then hit play and let's dive in to help you make your business binge-worthy.